welcome you all to our panel titled The Holocaust, Antisemitism, and the Memory of the Jewish Past in the Arab World. This is a topic that is really represents one half of a burgeoning new and a very important field that is seeking to recapture a past that has been erased, silenced, and forgotten over the course of a very traumatic 20th century. Since the 1950s, nearly every Arab country has a clause in its constitution rooting legislation in Islamic law. And so it is one of the great puzzles of 20th century history that while we have seen the burgeoning of mass movements seeking freedom from tyranny, freedom from colonial rule, the establishment of social justice and rights for all, we have also seen the closing down of politics and a kind of sectarianization become quite entrenched, not only in the more notorious cases of Lebanon, but elsewhere. We come together to present what I feel as a historian as an important new historiography on an understudied field, and that is the ways in which in the mid-20th century, the story of the Holocaust and the trauma it caused amongst Jews, amongst Europeans, and its effects in the Middle East, which is a neglected sector, and World War II, clashed with as well the story of decolonization, the fight for independence from European colonial empires. Both colonialism and the Holocaust were manifestations of European racism that was hitched particularly powerfully and in deadly ways in the 19th century to the expansive colonialism of European empires. We, unfortunately, though, in scholarship, have only recently and only rarely linked the violence against Jews in Europe to the violence of colonial wars, of expansion, and to the more generalized construction of a hateful enemy other, right? The complex relationship of the project then of Zionists to create a safe haven for Jews from Europe and to settle in Palestine necessarily and tragically crossed into the project of peoples who lived in the region, and particularly Arab peoples, to gain independence from the very colonial empires that were helping Zionists establish their haven. And so it is this complex history that accounts in part, as our speakers have noted in the prefaces to their own books, for the silence and the misunderstanding and the forgetfulness of a past history of coexistence, and of a past history and even the possibility or memory of a relationship where Arabs, Muslim Arabs, even Christian Arabs may have participated in the rescue of Jews in the Holocaust. I think it is fitting this fall as the United Nations celebrates its 75th anniversary, and in which the leaders in that forum called for in September the final decolonization of a world that still suffers the legacies of colonial rule and of racist imperialism down to today, that we approach then the tragic, emotional, and intellectual legacies that have allowed for a deformation of information and memory of what happened in the 1940s and afterward, and in keeping with the theme of this series of the rise of a different kind of anti-Semitism, if you will, following the Holocaust. I'll end my introduction with just a little bit of a quote from Lebanese historian Elias Houri, who wrote a foreword to a recent volume called The Holocaust and the Nakba being the catastrophe the Palestinians felt upon their expulsion from Palestine after 1948 and their lingering and continuing, if you will, living in limbo without a state, right? He notes and warns us about the complexity of the language that we use and of the categories that we use, that their meaning is rarely transparent, and that there are hidden connections amongst words that we use, like Holocaust and like Nakba, both terms, he notes, that are a linked catastrophe to the legacy of European colonialism and racism. He writes in the introduction to the volume that the two events were fused after 1948 in the minds of both Arabs and Jews, that the young Israeli state mobilized the Holocaust politically, which would feed into the ways in which, as we'll see in a few moments, Arabs would choose to remember or not remember the Holocaust. And so too did Palestinians mobilize their Nakba as the beginning of a continuing disaster. He reminds us, however, that the two terms have a common origin and a common meaning and a common struggle of humanity against racism. And so I applaud our scholars, and I hope we'll start a conversation today that advances the kind of linked and relational history with careful nuance rather than polemic as we try to retrieve the human experience and the linkages that we all have amongst one another. So let us begin then with Professor Afridi, author of Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
So I just wanted to say a few words about my work. I wrote Shoah Through Muslim Eyes as both academic but also a personal journey. I wanted people in the larger public to listen to a Muslim woman who was acknowledging the Holocaust and talking about the complexity of the Holocaust, but also the complexity of colonization. And I think it was a question of acknowledging one another and one another's suffering in terms of who we are as human beings, especially me being a Muslim and doing Holocaust work in terms of looking at Judaism. My other kind of question always, and it's still a lingering question, is how do we remember one another? In what context, and what do we do with that memory in terms of future generations? And as a religious studies scholar, I find that Jews and Muslims have a very packaged kind of way of seeing interreligious relations. And I wanted to break that and talk about the complexity of it, not just in the Arab, North African context, but also in the contemporary context, whether it's Asian Muslims, African Muslims, European Muslims. So primarily I work on two sides of the coin. I teach classes on the Holocaust and I teach classes on Islam. So every day I'm dealing with the complexity of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But the main point, and I think the main thing I wanted to do, both on an academic, intellectual, and emotional level, was to put on a piece of paper as a Muslim the acknowledgement and full historical fact of the Shoah. Throughout my book, I keep consistent with the word Shoah rather than the Holocaust, and I talk about my preference for that word. I also ask the Jewish audience in my book to actually read about colonization and the impact of that on all Muslims, basically in all Muslim countries. So as myself, a Pakistani coming from a colonized country, one of the long-standing colonizations, still having connections there, my whole family still lives there and goes there all the time. This was a very important book for me. And it was a book about peace and courage and to be self-critical of one's own absence of memory, or I would say repression of memory, or I would say the eradication of one another's memory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Afridi. Now, our next speaker is Robert Satloff of the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. Welcome, Robert.
My own work on looking at Holocaust memory in the Arab world started 20 years ago, or almost 20 years ago, on 9/11. It's a rather convoluted story, but let's just say that my whole objective here is to try to find a way to talk to Arabs about the Holocaust that makes it part of their story. And I didn't know it at the time, but I just assumed that there was a their story. And so I then spent the next several years investigating their story. And I came to learn that for 3 years, from May of 1940 to May of 1943, Arab countries, certainly in North Africa, under Nazi, Vichy, Italian fascist control, imposed on their Jewish populations almost all of the same aspects of persecution as were imposed on the Jewish populations of Europe, to varying degrees and various extent, except for extermination. Of course, that's a huge except when one thinks of the Shoah. But when one thinks of it from the bottom up, in terms of discrimination and bias and impact on property and life and schools and daily existence. It's an enormous impact. And so I sought to tell their story, and then I sought to tell the story of the Arabs around them, who actually, as I came to learn, experienced almost the exact same role in that story as did Europeans in the European version of the Holocaust. Participants, resistance, and bystanders. And to tell that story, and especially to tell the story from my perspective of those Arabs who risked their lives to save Jews, in my view, opened up a new window to try to talk with Arab and Muslim populations about the Holocaust today. This is a discussion about Holocaust memory. I think what's important to note is the victors get to write the history. So if you look at, for example, just the three French countries in North Africa, French-speaking countries that I focused on, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, only one is governed today by essentially the same regime that was in power to a certain extent 75 years ago, and that's Morocco. And so you have a great pride in Morocco today about the role that the monarchy played 75 years ago. The other two countries, Algeria and Tunisia, history has gone through various evolutions. Each regime gets to rewrite it the way they'd like their people to see it. And so you don't have contemporary leaders projecting the same pride, even if, as in both Tunisia and Algeria, there are remarkable stories, uplifting, positive stories of Arabs protecting, saving, working on behalf of their fellow Jews. Trying to unleash that, trying to bring that back has been something that I've been trying to do for the last 15 or so years. I've had the privilege of lecturing in Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt and Jordan and in Jerusalem and Arab universities on these issues. And I can say there's a thirst. There is a real thirst for understanding of what the history really is. The last comment is you can even begin to see it from Muslim groups in those countries today. So for Morocco today, there's an organization of mostly young Muslims called Memuna, which is investing in bringing back Jewish culture and appreciating Jewish culture in Morocco today. Even in Tunisia, there was an exhibit not too long ago put on by the U.S. Holocaust Museum of propaganda, looking through the eyes of the Holocaust era propaganda, but it struck a note among Tunisians about how propaganda can be used today, just the same way it might have been used 75 years ago. There is a connection, there is a thirst, and I believe that with effort by scholars such as Omar and Minaz, we can bring back the conversation about the historical memory of Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims in all these countries from generations ago.
Thank you so much, Robert. And our third speaker is Omar Boom of UCLA, author of Memory of Absence. Welcome.
I call myself a historical anthropologist, so history and anthropology are in conversation all the time in my work. I grew up I came of age in Morocco in the 1980s, 1990s, where conversations about Israel-Palestine in Moroccan public universities in Marrakesh that I attended were central. So going and doing a PhD at the University of Arizona and starting to think about the Jewish memory, I really wanted to figure out a way how to understand how Muslims or how different generations of Muslims remember, construct, think about Jews and Judaism today. As the country went from about 240,000 Jews in the mid-20th century to less than 3,000 Jews today. So this idea of the physical absence, how does this physical absence translate when it comes to memory, but not especially to generational memory? So the work that I've done, I didn't focus on cities because I knew that the discourse there would be much more in connection with the center, the heartland of the Middle East. So I went to areas where there were a lot of Jews in the south, in the Saharan region, and Jewish history and Muslim history was entangled together. So I decided to do a work on 4 generations from the same family, sometimes the great grandparents, the grandparents, the parents, and the young adults. And for me, carrying out this ethnographic work, I first of all figured out exactly how do people still remember these Jewish communities? Is there still a connection that exists between the Muslims and Jews today who are living either in France or in Ashdod or in Beersheba and so on and so forth? So that's the for me, that was the starting point. Is first of all to see where memory fits and how can we move from the stage of memory to the nation state. So the idea is once I understood, first of all, that there is the Arab-Israeli conflict is definitely at the center of the construction of this memory, but it's not in the same way that among all the generations. Definitely the great-grandparents and the grandparents generation definitely had a different way of understanding these contexts. But the younger generation is, as most of you would probably conclude, definitely construct this memory through its present moment. So that's why I moved from this small place in the southern part of Morocco to the nation state. So for me, constructing about how the nation constructs and sees and uses this history in not only internally, but also externally. So the politics of memory are tied also with the politics of representation and the politics of what I call foregrounding and the backgrounding of Jewish history. And so not only in terms of museums, but also in terms of movie and cinematic production. So all of these things are also tied to the use, the conservation of Jewish history, conservation of Jewish cemeteries, and also the connections between Morocco as a state, as a nation, and its Jewish diaspora, not only within Israel, but also outside of Israel. The Jewish history in Morocco and the rest of North Africa is very rich. It's part of the identity of those countries. It's part of the identity of the region. People are aware of it, but I think that the next step is how to translate this knowledge we know about these communities, not only to the university, because I think universities have done a good job as far as the work. You have Moroccans, Muslims studying these topics, engaging with these topics, but how does it fit in the middle school and the high school? And I think that's where a lot of things has to be still done. And because that's when you talk about memory and the translation of memory and where you move forward with the next generation, I think making sure that the generation of that younger generation is aware of that history through textbooks, through history textbooks. And that's, I think, where a lot of work needs to be done, not only in Morocco, but I think in the rest of the Arab world and the Middle East and North Africa, as well as I think that has work the same work that has to be done also in Europe and Israel too.
Maybe we should start with that question of education and of ignorance and of generations. Actually, let me run this back. I want to start with a question to Professor Boom, who in your book, you found that memory was conditioned very differently amongst the generations, that the oldest generation who had actual memories of living alongside Jews had a very different reference to younger students who had never met Jews and who were more exposed through current curricula in schools to a very different, and as I think you suggested in your introduction, to looking at Jews through the prism of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Is that correct? Yeah. Would you elaborate a little bit on that? And then I think as well, in your work, both Robert and Menaz, you have also had to grapple with perhaps change over time in knowledge and memory. But let's start with Professor Boom.
So I think that's really an excellent question. I think when you look at those communities, the communities that I began my work with are rural communities, southern communities that are tied in an economy of farming and subsistence and agriculture. So the connections between the different groups were tied at least until the 1970s, I would say, because of the lack of migration, not only internal, but also external migration. So once you have a shift in terms of labor, and you start seeing, or at least in terms of education, when the younger generation starts to go to schools and leave the villages, I think that at least from what I've noticed as far as the conversations between the older generation and the younger generation, we start seeing a crisis of transmission of memory. And I think that crisis of transmission of memory has been taken and replaced by what happens, the circle that happens in university or that happens in schools. And I can speak even for myself too. And that void needs to be filled with very constructive educational curriculum. And that's, I think, where the missing point is that I'm not suggesting that you can't have those conversations about the Arab-Israeli conflict and within Moroccan circles. But I think what you're missing also, you're missing about the complexities and the nuances and the richness of a Jewish history, that it's absent in many ways from those textbooks and from those history books.
Okay, so maybe we can make a link here. Give me a moment to do so, because you're mentioning a younger generation that seems to be opposing what Robert referred to as a kind of official pride in having saved and shielded Jews from Vichy France and from the Nazis in World War II. Could the two of you speak to that? I mean, there seems to be a sort of, I don't know what is taught in schools, but to a degree that I have visited Morocco and seen, with great pride, a tour guide show me the old Jewish quarter and, in Casablanca and so on, right? What is happening with memory there? On one hand, there is a pride in the past. On the other hand, is there a rejection of that narrative, Omar? I don't know. Is there still a memory that the king had shielded Jews in the 1940s?
Yes. I think that's a dominant part of the memory, and I think there is also the pride in the Jewish heritage. There is the fact the reason why you go to cemeteries now in Morocco is still intact. There is no targeting of Jewish, and not only there is no targeting of Jewish sites and cemeteries and shrines, but it's also conserved. There's a huge conservation effort. So I'm not talking about that side. I'm talking also about the level of how you carry out the memory. The memory also has to be carried out through schooling and through education. So the university has done a good job as far as the research. There is no doubt about that. But I think there is also another element where if you want to create and maintain that same level where it's happened at the level of universities, right, you have also to inject a new life through primary, secondary, and high school education.
Okay. Manas, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of shift it a little bit if that's possible.
Absolutely.
But one of the problems in terms of education and curriculum, and it's not just in Morocco, but it's in many other countries, Arab and non-Arab, Asian and African, is that this idea that the locus of, say, in the 1980s and 90s that you're talking about in terms of situating oneself in Israel and Palestine, right? The whole complexity of that. There was a physical eradication of the word Israel and Jew out of textbooks, which I witnessed myself as a child in the Middle East. So there is a kind of force. That's why I call eradication of memory, right? Eradication of memory is not that, Jews are not even existent in these textbooks that we had to read. And these textbooks were written by Europeans. And the supervisors would come and they would block out this word Jew in Israel. The other thing I want to say is that I think the education curriculum is really important, Omar, but I also think that I'm really interested in the people on the street because it disturbs me when I go to an airport somewhere which is predominantly Muslim country where there's Mein Kampf being sold, or when there's a clothing store that's called Hitler. So, I mean, and it's this unconscious sort of idea on the street that this is all okay because of the lack of the education, not just in the curriculum, because that would be another process in all of these different education systems, but the sort of common culture or ethos that goes on in terms of the conspiracy against the Jews, anti-Semitism, and all of that. So I'm really, really, really fascinated with looking at pop culture, right? And what's on the street in terms of the streets of Cairo or Karachi or, different places in the world where these things are just part of the consciousness and not questioned anymore as being racist or problematic. And it's because of the vacuum of that preservation of Jewish memory, but also the eradication of a memory. And I think that is something we need to talk about, is how does that memory just go away, right? So, a lot of the times when I talk about colonization, I always say to Muslim students or Muslim audiences, you can't get rid of your colonial mindset. It's part of your DNA. So you can't just deracinate and say, oh, I no longer am influenced by the Christian missionaries, or I'm no longer influenced by the language of the French or the language of the British. It becomes part of that. And I think we're so prone to separate our history and the imprints that we forget and eradicate what really disturbs us. And I think there's something interesting in terms of the uncanny of memory, what makes us feel really uncomfortable. And I think that has to be worked on in the education system, of course, because I love teaching and I'm an educator. But primarily, I think pop culture, like just the culture on the street and how people think about the notion of the other, especially the Jew in my part of the world, which is the Muslim world.
Robert, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I want to tell a very quick story that illustrates the not just the disappearance of memory, but the twisting. And I think there's a hopeful end to all this. There's a wonderful story I tell in my book about the mayor of Tunis who saved about 60 Jews during World War II who escaped from a German labor camp and showed up at his farm. And he protected them throughout the balance of the war. Now, this story is written about in books by the Jewish community in the mid and late 1940s. So it's printed, it's out there. That's why the subtitle of my book is about the lost stories. These stories were known. So I went to try to find the kids and grandkids of that wonderful Arab mayor who saved these Jews. And when I found them, they told a completely different story. Not about their grandfather having protected 60 Jews, but their grandfather having protected German POWs who escaped from an Allied POW camp just after the conclusion of the war. Now, there's zero evidence to suggest the POW story is true. The saving of the Jews is confirmed by lots of testimonies. But somewhere that story was transformed in the 50s and the 60s and the height of Nasserism and the birth of republicanism in Tunisia and across the Middle East. It became impossible to tell a story about just saving Jews, having nothing to do with Israel. Now, I think that there is a movement now to reclaim that history. And the grandchildren do not fight the history of their grandfather once it is explained to them. They actually, most of them, now embrace it. And I think that that type of re-embracing, putting it into the context of the day, is something that we as historians and scholars can help, because I think there's a thirst now. I think there's a desire for young Arabs in many countries to know a lot more. They realize that their elders, their parents and grandparents, and the people who have been running their governments for the last 30, 40, 50 years have been denying them all sorts of things, including their own history. And I think that there is a thirst and a receptivity. How one does it, the sensitivity of how one approaches it, it's a challenge. But I think that there is an enormous desire out there to be to give to let them reclaim their own history.
I just want to make one point in terms of education. I do believe, because there are many organizations I work with that are doing Holocaust education in places that are very impossible, like Pakistan, where I'm from. but they actually work. Holocaust education works in a way that I think most people don't understand. And, you know, yesterday I gave a presentation on Muslim victimization, and somebody asked me, well, why would people be interested in that? Because, you know, Muslims and Arabs are seen as aggressors. And I thought to myself, well, the same reason why Muslims wouldn't be interested in Jews being victims, right? Like, if there's this kind of weird idea that somehow, you know, we can't see the victimization of the other. And if we do that, we somehow become less victim, right? So it's called in genocide studies, Olympics of genocide. But I think that, you know, when you start to talk about the Holocaust in the context of history, and then you pull in North Africa and you start talking about the Vichy and what happened in North Africa, students are like, wait, what? And you have to also educate them about colonial history. So in a sense, you're doing all these different pieces at one time. And it's a very challenging class to teach, because your students have to have colonial history. They have to know something about Islam. They have to know something about Judaism. They have to have the history of the Holocaust. And then you're like, whoa. And then when you give them narratives and testimonies, whether they're Tunisian, Jewish survivors and what they witnessed, right, or bystanders, that's when things start clicking, the narrative, right, the testimony, the personal stories, and then they go, wow. So there are ways to do that, but it's very hard to get into the educational system in many places. Now, I want to remind you that only 20% of the Muslim world is Arab. We keep forgetting that. So there's a huge part of the Muslim world that we still need to address in terms of anti-Semitism or these issues of memory, and whose memory and how we think of Jews themselves.
Perhaps we can jump off of that a little bit in distinguishing Arab from Muslim and establishing contexts in which memory is formed. To what degree is it related to being Muslim that you would erase, you know, or is that the category we want to be using? And when we want to speak about the erasure of the memory of the Holocaust or the distortion of that memory, to what degree do we want other frames, you know, in our analysis? Because there is a, and perhaps maybe we could address this question a little bit in terms of, I think our students and our audience might appreciate your insights and your experience in conducting the interviews that you did, and the ways in which the either victims or, you know, neighbors who were interviewed, or grandchildren who were interviewed, what categories were they using when they described their relationship to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust? Did that raise any issues for you in doing your own work?
When I did my ethnographic work, I was very careful to never name things from my own perspective as a scholar who has this luggage coming with this discourse from a Jewish studies or Holocaust studies, but I let people talk about their relations with Jews. They talk about partnerships, economic partnerships. They talk about social gathering. They talk about talking to the rabbis and so on and so forth. And the discourse, the terminology, I agree with you. I think there is an indigenous terminology that shifts depending on the time, from whether you use the word Yehudi or Israeli or other terms. I think those are things that I think we have to be aware of. I think there is also the challenge of how we translate this knowledge to a general public or general audiences, not only an American audience, but also a Middle Eastern, North African audience. As researchers, for me, as personally, I think our knowledge should not be stay within the walls of universities. I think our knowledge has to serve the general public. And that's the challenge we have as scholars and as researchers.
Just a word. I agree completely with what Omar just said. The grayness of this issue strikes me every time I look at it again. There is nothing black and white about this history. There are it's not Arabs and Jews. It's not Muslims and Jews. You have to look individually at different countries and regions. There's Berbers and and Arabs. There's Europeanized local elites versus different groups that have nothing to do with European culture whatsoever. Same on the Jewish side. Jews who have been in this part of the world for 2,000 years versus Jews who are much more recent arrivals and much more Europeanized in their culture and outlook. It's the complexity of the relationships, differ across the Middle East, and even more broadly in the Muslim world, a term I'm not a big fan of. But still, there are some basic commonalities. And the one that I tried to underscore is agency, is that regardless of whether you were under the most vicious form of European colonialism, everybody made a choice. Everybody had a choice to a certain extent of during this period and later on of bystander, participant, or a rescuer. And the choice is blurred, to be sure, but everybody had a choice. And reminding people that even at the worst moments of history, everybody has a choice. They have a choice today, and they had a choice 75 years ago, is, I think, an important aspect of the education, which I totally agree needs to get much lower than the progress that we've made at universities, but much lower and much broader than we've been able to do so far.
Manas, did you want to comment? I mean, you discuss at length, I think, in your book, the degrees to which there's anything within Islam, essentially, that shapes the way the Muslims you've interviewed respond, but the ways in which it does not, too.
Yeah, I mean, again, religious studies person, but I have a chapter that is called, Is Islam Anti-Semitic? And then, no, is what I say. So one of the things that, like I said, I'm dealing with anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, and I spend a lot of time, not just in the classroom, but at synagogues and mosques, and doing a lot of partnerships in the Riverdale, New York area, and also internationally in places like Bosnia and Turkey, because I run the center. So there's a lot of initiatives that we do all over for Holocaust education, but also Muslim education. So one of the things that I found very interesting was that a lot of Jews in the audience would ask me why the Quran was anti-Semitic, and they would refer to certain things and certain verses that are problematic in the Quran. So what I did was, in that book, was to flesh out these verses and say, yes, this could be seen this way, and this could be seen that way, and this is what actually the Hadith says, and this is what the Quran says, right? So just to flesh out the religious sort of libel, in a sense, against Muslims being anti-Semitic inherently if we are Muslims. The second point, I think, that I looked at was when I interviewed Muslims and anti-Semitism and what they thought about Jews, was that a lot of them didn't really know why they were anti-Semitic, right? There was a sort of like loss of memory. Oh, I think they did something terrible to us at the time of Muhammad. And I'm like, okay, can you recount that story? No, I don't remember, but we shouldn't like them. So the memory was very diffused and very strange. It wasn't just about Israel and Palestine. There was a lot of these lapses and these gaps and fissures that was like, oh, I think they're controlling our countries. Okay, so I'd say, okay, how so? Like, explain that. And there was just kind of silence, or this kind of withdrawal of, I don't know why I'm saying this. I have no idea. This is why I'm talking about this memory being so deeply ingrained. And these are young people. I'm talking about people in their 20s that are in college or are just out of college working. So I think this is really important for us to think about, is that, and we know that, I mean, if you teach the Holocaust, you know that the myth around the Jew is a fabrication, but not just overnight between 1933 and 1945, but it comes from all the way back to Christianity, right? Through the movement of medieval times and with Jews living under Christians. So these are long-standing myths that become real. And these myths, as we know, were transported, a lot of the European myths, into the Arab world. And David Mutadil has an excellent book about Islam and Germany that explains this beautifully. And there was propaganda sent into the Arab world because the Germans wanted allies. And a lot of the times when you think about this, you're like, okay, well, they bought this. Well, they bought this because they were vulnerable and they saw Jews as colonial. They did not see Jews in terms of looking at Palestine as Jews or Arab Jews or European Jews. They saw this kind of perception. And this point of history is so important. If we could just say, look at the perception we had of one another at a moment of time, from the 1920s all the way to the 1940s, and what was going on in terms of the Holocaust and colonization. And this kind of, if you can educate people about this perception and have them just sit back and look at their own perception of what that period was, I think you can really change and transform people's thinking and get them excited about, wow, I can see this differently now, right? That Israel becomes this colonial state, the Jews become European, they don't look like Arabs, they don't act like Arabs, and they are Europeans, right? That come into Palestine. So these are really important things in terms of memory, how we see it and how we perceive that. And I talk about this in my book, but I also teach about this all the time, and I have my students sit back and kind of meditate on this moment. Because then you have an exchange of perception, whether it's negative or whether it's positive, but it's real. And that perception goes down to other generations.
To what degree, then, should we outline a level of research or further research, for example, on the specific ways in which, I think if I'm reading your argument correctly, is that the kind of anti-Semitism we're dealing with today in the Arab world is not deeply rooted in Islam, is a very recent vintage. Some scholars have pointed to Nazi propaganda problematically. There's been a bit of pushback on some of the books that have come out. To what degree did Arabs even read or hear that propaganda, much less how do we know whether they took Nazi messages to heart? To what degree, and this is the elephant in the room, was it the political exploitation of the 1948 war and the displacement of Palestinians and the bitterness? I mean, let me just say this. I did do a bit of research for a chapter in one of my books on one of the leaders of the PLO, Abu Iyad, right? And my question there was, how did this man, if you read in Arabic, his writings, the biographies of him and so on, how did this man not realize that organizing a capture of hostages in Munich, of all places, in 1972 in the Olympics, was not going to send a horrific and counterproductive message about where Palestinians are coming from? And what I was astonished to learn as I did my research into Arabic sources was that the man didn't know much, even by 1972, about the Holocaust. But if you look back into his own memoirs, what he did know was that he grew up in Jaffa, in a neighborhood that bordered Tel Aviv. He had memories of his father speaking Hebrew to Jewish customers in their grocery store, right? And that he blamed Europeans for destroying the coexistence that they felt. That's generation one. What happens after generation two, after 1972? And the political circumstances and the enduring non-resolution of what writers like Elias Houri point to as a companion, albeit lesser, catastrophe, right? Palestinians were displaced. They were not murdered en masse, right? But it is a stumbling block to see that your disaster is not being recognized, and yet the other is. Perhaps maybe we can make a few comments on that before we turn to the Q&A. To what degree does this have to become a relational and mutual investigation on memories of the separate catastrophes? Anybody want to take a piece of that?
I think, first of all, thanks, Liz, for mentioning this example, because I think it's really at the heart of our obligations and the obligations within Jewish studies and Holocaust studies to open its doors to scholars who work with different languages and different backgrounds. And I think that for me personally, moving from, as a historical anthropologist, moving from Jewish Muslim memories to Holocaust studies and Holocaust work, I think it's really linked to this project. Why? Because, as you said, we do have documentation in other languages in Arabic. We do have access to memories, still living memories about this period. So more research needs to be done on this, and I think I applaud a lot of institutions, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, were basically opening its doors to a lot of scholars who are working on these topics from different backgrounds, from West Africa to North Africa to the Middle East. And I think that's really a step, first of all, to broaden the knowledge and to add another layer of complexity to this understanding and to this research. Because you're right, those stories really make things much more clear instead of just reading things from the present moment.
Thank you. Robert, any concluding thoughts before we open up for Q&A?
Well, look, just on this issue, first, I think the Palestinian story is not unique in the broader Arab story, but it is more intense than any other, more intense than the Moroccan narrative or the Algerian narrative or Tunisian or Libyan or whatever. And it is a deeply personal engagement with what happened in 48 and beyond. Here, in all my lectures in Arab countries, when this issue emerges, I ask my audiences, let's get on the history train. If you want to get off in 1940, let's get off in 1940. If you want to get off in 42, let's get off in 42. If you want to stay on all the way to 48, I'll stay on all the way to 48. But you can't refuse to get on the train. And if because it's your history, if 48 is too painful because it suggests all sorts of things about Jewish power and it transforms your image of the world in a topsy-turvy way, because for the first time Jews are exercising sovereignty, exercising power in a region where they had never done so before. And that is so alien that it's difficult to embrace. That's fine. We won't even go there. We'll get off. We'll stop by 43. But please don't say you won't go up with me through 43, 44, 45. And I'd say the vast majority of people are willing to do that, putting aside what happens afterwards, knowing that is a much more difficult and complex story. It doesn't mean we don't do it, but give everyone the option of getting off the train wherever they feel comfortable.
Right. But even I had a colleague at UVA who taught a fabulous course on, Jewish Muslim memories of 1948. Highly popular course. What you notice even amongst Palestinian Arabs, though, in those first few years is two things. One, admiration. Abu Iyad read Menachem Begin's book. Oh, so he figured out how to get rid of the British colonizers, right? Maybe we can learn from them. There was an admiration that they had decolonized, but then a bitterness sets in. Where's our independence? Where's the UN in recognizing, that I'm not sure. I think we need a better and richer history of how memory and experience and attitudes unfold in relationship and reaction to one another, as opposed to the stories that I think state leaders have imposed upon us for their own purposes, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Manaz, I thought we really should get questions. We're running a little low on time.
I constantly talk about this perception, and I agree with Robert. It doesn't have to be 1948, right? It can be before that. But I also think that there should be conversations about difficult contemporary times between Jews and Muslims, and that we shouldn't just historicize, right? So there's a tendency for people to have nostalgia of how Jews and Muslims were just brothers and sisters during this, wonderful time, and what was called the Golden Age in Spain. And there were good times, but there was still anti-Semitism and there was still resentment, right? So, I think one of the things that, and I think Robert said this earlier, it's not a black and white history.
Yeah.
Right? And it's never going to be a black and white history because human beings are complicated, whether you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Hindu or whatever you are. And I think that's where we like to organize our lives in a way that is black and white. And when those things become really blurry, we sort of get uncomfortable. We want to see these things encased in a way. So I always encourage my students that if you are confused in my class, that's a good sign. I've done something good here, right? But if you're coming out and saying, oh, I know everything about Muslims and the Holocaust, well, this is just a taster. It's a taster to throw out things at you to kind of explore and think about in the future. So I think that's what I want to say in terms of human complexity. Human complexity is so needed, especially today in the world.
Yes. All right. Here's a question. Yep. For the entire 19th century, the only colonialism that affected the Eastern Arab world was the Ottoman Empire. The British and French did not arrive on that scene until World War I, relatively late. North Africa's experience was different, with French imperialism curling and Spanish earlier. So how does this difference between Eastern and Western Arabs' historical experience affect the reaction to the Holocaust, Zionism, and the Jewish world? Anybody want to take a bite out of that question? That's again, thinking about regional specificities. Yeah, Robert.
Just historically, the European actors in the Holocaust principally focused. It occurred in North Africa. There was a certain moment in Syria and Lebanon, very brief Vichy control there. You had the issue in Iraq with the sort of German-friendly government. Although it's important to note that the terrible events that people remember in Iraq actually occurred after the demise of the Nazi government and technically under British control in Baghdad, a fact which is often conveniently forgotten by people who like to talk about this issue.
Nice point. Yeah.
But the main body of sort of Holocaust experience in the Middle East, in Arab countries, was principally between Morocco and Libya, between 40 and 43.
Good point. And other comments there? Let's go into the next one. I heard the speakers talk about the premises of their work. Can they tell us what they found, including examples? Oh boy, this is an open-ended one, but maybe think of one salient interview or incident that you'd like to highlight from your work.
Well, many examples of Arabs who saved Jews, but I think the one that struck me the most, I interviewed somebody for a film in Paris. He hated Arabs. Elderly Jewish man living in a one-room apartment. He hated Arabs, and he spewed the worst venom. And we were talked for hours about his hatred of, this was in the time when Arabs in Paris there was enormous hatred. And then finally, hours into our conversation, he says, there was this one guy who saved me during the Nazi occupation when the SS was trying to round us up. And I hid in his hammam for several weeks in the basement of his hammam while the Nazis were going door to door. He was a brave man. And then I went to Tunisia and found that guy's son and found the hammam where this older guy was saved. And the story fit perfectly. And it just showed you that you could, even in your own mind, you could transform this history because of your later experience. And trying to peel it away and reclaim that is a challenge, but it's out there to be repealed and reclaimed.
Please comment on the specific post-Holocaust and post-colonial traumas that clash in European societies and how these could be reconciled.
talking about Europe, especially France and Germany, one sees this conflict of post-Holocaust memory, right? And also the rise of anti-Semitism. And then you see the post-colonial memory of the migrant, Muslim Arab migrant, and the rise of Islamophobia. Actually, it's a very, very important thing to think about when you think about European history and memory, because Europeans have two things at hand, right? So the question, one of the things that I think we are lacking in our educational curriculum, especially in the United States, is European history in terms of the 50s and 60s and what happened there, and the migration of Arabs and Africans and Muslims that went to work there as temporary workers, right? And then they kind of stayed and had families. So if you go to, say, a place like Berlin, and I was there when they took in 1 million Syrian refugees, and there was a huge pushback, like, oh my God, what are we doing? We can't deal with these people, of course, because they're Muslim and they're Arabs. But what if you went and talked to them, which I did, where they were staying, they were all professionals, PhD, doctors, teachers. I mean, amazing. They were like the most professional people. And they approached the local people in Berlin because they were stationed in this big government building because they felt embarrassed that there were porta toilets in front of the building because there weren't enough bathrooms. And they went to the local people in Berlin and said, I'm sorry that this porta toilet is in front of your residence or your area, but we would like to extend our services to you. Do you want us to clean your house? Do you need any Medicare? Do you need anything at all? We have all these professionals. It's just a little story about what happens with our perception of the other and how that can change when we give it a chance. So this post-colonial memory, this fear that you're an immigrant living in a country that colonized you, your culture, your language, took your resources, and then this post-Holocaust fear that you're in a country that murdered you, persecuted you, picked you from every single country that they could, is a real important aspect of what's going on today, because we talk about the height of anti-Semitism and the height of Islamophobia neck to neck in places like Germany and France.
I want to thank all three of our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, everyone.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.